So we looked at HTML and we looked at React. Now we're going to learn a little bit of JavaScript. Why would we need to learn JavaScript if Framer uses React? Well, React is a JavaScript framework. That means it's written in JavaScript. So when we're writing React code in Framer, we're writing JavaScript. A lot of the code that we will write will be a specific React style of JavaScript, but it will still follow the rules of JavaScript. So we need to know what those rules are. And some of the code we write will just be standard JavaScript. It won't be specific to React, so we need to know some of those basics before we get started coding in Framer. So I'm going to be using this online tool called REPL.js. This isn't a tool that we'll actually use for our Framer projects, but it's good for this demo because it allows me to type JavaScript code on the left, and then on the right it will print out the result of whatever code I've typed. So if I type 2 plus 2 on the left, on the right it will display the result of that, which is 4. So it just makes it easy for me to show what the code is doing without having to build a full Framer project with graphics and UI and all that stuff. So let's get started learning about variables. If you've never programmed before, you might still remember variables from algebra class, where you'd have an equation like this, where each of these letters represents a placeholder for a number. And if you change the number that any one of these variables represents, it will change the equation. In this case, it would change the slope of this line. But don't freak out, we are not going to do any algebra here, but we will use that same concept of named variables that represent real values. So in JavaScript, I create a variable by typing the keyword let, followed by the variable name. I get to make up this name, and I can name my variable almost anything. I just have to make sure it doesn't start with a number, and that it doesn't have any spaces or any crazy special characters in the name. And I also have to make sure that the name I'm trying to use isn't already being used by another variable in my code. It has to be unique. So I'll create this variable called rating. And if I look on the right side here, it says undefined, because although I created this variable, I haven't assigned a value to it yet. I like to think of variables as little named containers that you can put data into. So here, I've created a container, I've given it a name, but there's nothing in it yet. It's undefined. I can put something in it by simply setting it equal to some value. And now anywhere I use that named variable in my code, I get back that number that I put inside. A quick aside about this let keyword. If you've used JavaScript before, you might be more used to seeing the keyword var for creating variables. Let is sort of a more modern replacement for var. There are technically some differences between the two, which I won't get into, and you can still use var. It will still work, but all the code examples that we'll see for Framer projects will use let, so we should get used to seeing let, and we should probably be using let in our projects just to be consistent with what the rest of the Framer community is doing. And notice I only need to use the let keyword when I first create the variable. After that, anytime I use the variable, I can just refer to it by name. So for example, if I want to change the rating, say I change my mind and I want this to be 8.5, I can just set the new value like I did when I created it. Notice also that the order of this code matters. Our code gets executed from the top down. So when I create the variable, it holds the value 9.9. And it continues to hold that value everywhere I use it until we get to the line where I change it to 8.5. So changing it here doesn't affect anything that happens before this line. That also means that I can't try to use my variable anywhere in my code that's before the line where I create it. So if I go up here a few lines before I use the let keyword to create my variable and try to use it, I will get an error. This is JavaScript telling me it doesn't know what the rating variable is because I'm trying to use it before I've actually created it on line 4. Now, my variables don't have to just hold numbers. They can hold pretty much any kind of data. Numbers are a very common type of data we'll use, but so is text. So I can create a variable to hold my album name. Notice when I use text, I need to put it inside of quotes. So JavaScript knows that I mean for this to be text and not a variable name or something else that it needs to interpret. Programmers would call a bit of text like this a string because it's a string of characters strung together. So I can create another variable to hold another string for my artist name. And I'll create one more called isExplicit that holds a Boolean value. A Boolean is a value that can only be true or false. And I don't use the quotes here because false is a JavaScript keyword. It's not a text string like we're using up here. This is a special word that JavaScript knows how to interpret. I'll create one last variable for the album year. Now I can also use variables to store the result of an expression. So if I want to calculate and store the age of my album, I can create a variable called age and set it to this equation, the current year minus my album year. But this age variable doesn't hold this equation, it holds the result of that equation. So if I use that variable somewhere else in my code, it's not pulling up this equation, it's pulling up the number 51, which is the result of 2019 minus 1968. Now that I have all these bits of data stored in variables, I can start to do stuff with them. So if I want to output some of this album info here, I can do something like this. See how I can add together strings of text just by using the plus sign? And that just concatenates together these two strings into a single string, which gets output on the right. And if I try to add together a string and a number, I'll always get a string. So now, just like when we created our template in React, we've done sort of the same thing here. Instead of directly typing out the album info, we've stored the data, the parts that might change, in variables. So if I go up here and change any of those variables, they'll get changed in the text below. So this is a pretty hokey example, but I could have code where these variables are used in a lot of different places in different parts of my code. And in that case, it would be really hard to maintain changes to all that data in all those different places without using variables. So there's two more things I want to show. The first is that I can assign a variable to another variable. So I can create a variable called rating2 and set it equal to the variable rating. Now rating2 has the same value as rating, which is currently 10. But what's actually happening is the value from rating is getting copied out of this variable and put into the rating2 variable. There's no link between these two variables. We're simply saying, take the value from rating and put it in rating2. So if I then change the value of rating, it doesn't have any effect on rating2. They aren't linked in any way. I simply copied the value from one to the other at a specific point in my code. So now even though I've changed rating to be 5, rating2 is still 10 because that's what the value of rating was at the time we copied the value and put it into the rating2 variable. And lastly, let's talk about constants. So constants work exactly like variables except for two things. First thing is we create them by using the keyword const instead of let. And as the name might suggest, we cannot change the value that we assign to a constant. It's not variable, it's constant. That's why we call it a constant. So if I create a constant for the title of my list, we can see that title on the right. This string of text is now stored in the constant called list title. And if I try to change that somewhere else in my code, I'll get an error. This error is telling me I can't change the value of this because this is a constant and not a variable. Now, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to create something that I can't change? Well, if I know my data is never going to change throughout my code, JavaScript can do some optimizations under the hood if I tell it explicitly that this data is constant and not variable. So I actually try to use constants wherever I can in my code and only use a let variable if I have something that will need to change later in that code. Okay, that's it for variables and constants. What did we learn? We learned that we can make reusable named containers in our code, and those containers can hold values of different types, and we create those containers using either a let variable or a constant.